And with Yom HaShoah being commemorated this Wednesday night and Thursday, in particular, usually it's the 27th of Nisan was the date that the Knesset determined to be Yom HaShoah V'Hagvura, the day of Holocaust remembrance and heroism, in connection with this being the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. One of the rules in Israel is that you don't commemorate Jewish national holidays on Fridays or anything proximate to Shabbos. So since the 27th of Nisan is on a Friday, they didn't want the commemoration of Yom HaShoah to slide into Shabbat, so they moved it. Back a day, made it earlier. So Wednesday night and Thursday will be Yom HaShoah. The various official commemorations in Israel. Many communities will do things on Wednesday night. On Thursday, we'll be having a conversation about memory Thursday morning at 10 o'clock in our 10 a.m. Parsha class slot. We'll be talking about memory. But for this morning, I thought I would take rip from the headlines into a pre-Yom HaShoah or Yom HaShoah direction. And went with the title, Is It Ever Too Late to Hunt Nazis? And so I think the answer to that is absolutely no. But there have been a couple of articles recently which remind us how the clock has been ticking and there may not be any more Nazis to hunt. The first is a news report from the end of February. It was all over. This text is taken from CNN. The U.S. deported a 95-year-old former Nazi concentration camp guard. Tennessee resident who was a guard at a Nazi concentration camp during World War II has been deported to Germany, the U.S. Justice Department said in a statement Friday. Frederick Karl Berger, a 95-year-old German citizen, was ordered removed from the U.S. in February 2020 when a U.S. immigration judge determined his willing service as a guard of concentration camp prisoners constituted assistance in Nazi-sponsored persecution, the Justice Department said. Berger was eligible for removal from the U.S. under the Holtzman Amendment, which prohibits anyone who participated in Nazi persecution from living in the U.S. The Board of Immigration Appeals upheld the ruling in November 2020. So it took a year and now several months, and now he's gone. Berger's trial found he had worked as an armed guard at Neuengamme subcamp near Meppen, Germany in 1945. I had not heard of this camp. I'm sure those who are more familiar with all of the camps and the Holocaust studies might be. Most of the prisoners there were Russian, Dutch, and Polish civilians, but there were also Jews, Danes, Latvians, French, Italians, and Nazi political opponents, the Justice Department said. The court found Berger admitted he guarded the prisoners to prevent their escape and that he didn't request a transfer from the camp guard service. According to the Justice Department, additionally, Berger still gets a pension from Germany for his employment there, including for his wartime service. I bolded that text because we're talking about someone who admitted what he had done. His activities were preventing from escape and not requesting a transfer. I mean, this determination, this finding that he served in a concentration camp and he had willing service, this isn't that he killed anybody. This is the fact that he had willing service and he didn't request a transfer. Again, no mitigation. Nazi is a Nazi is a Nazi, but it's interesting. This is not the war crimes that we necessarily sometimes envision or would hope for to come out in a trial. After his 2020 trial, Berger, then 94, told the Washington Post that much of the case was based on lies, saying, I was 19 years old. I was ordered to go there, right? Just following orders. That's a common refrain that was heard following World War II. He also said he was only at the camp for a short time and denied carrying a weapon. After 75 years, this is ridiculous. I cannot believe it, he said. I cannot understand how this can happen in a country like this. You're forcing me out of my home. Okay. Elderly man, 75 years living in his home. He's been forced out. Maybe that can sometimes elicit a sympathetic reaction in some people. Acting Attorney General Monty Wilkinson said in a statement, Berger's deportation demonstrates the Department of Justice's and its law enforcement partners' commitment to ensuring that the United States is not a safe haven for those who participate in Nazi crimes against humanity and other human rights abuses. This year marks the 75th anniversary of convictions of Nazi at Nuremberg. right, which will be commemorated later this year. Berger's case showed that the passage, even of many decades, will not deter the department from pursuing justice on behalf of the victims of Nazi crimes. Right, so is it ever too late? It's never too late. This 75 years later, they're still doing whatever is possible to ensure that justice is served. The Justice Department said Berger was the 70th Nazi persecutor removed from the United States. Acting U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement Director Tay Johnson said in a statement, the U.S. was committed to ensuring the country will not serve as a safe haven for human rights violators and war criminals. This case exemplifies a steadfast dedication of both ICE and the Department of Justice to pursue justice and to hunt relentlessly for those who participate in one of the history's greatest atrocities, no matter how long it takes, Johnson said. So this is reassuring language that justice must prevail. And in this case, it did, in that someone who was a Nazi and it followed the rule of law, and that a willing participant was therefore deported from the United States and sent back to Germany. Now, wanted to just follow this up with some of the reporting on this subject that appear at the same time in the New York Times, because how did they find this guy? What was the case against him? How did it emerge? So within the article, Tennessee man who served as Nazi camp guard is deported to Germany. The next article, it references the case against him. Also, it mentions Eli Rosenbaum, who is a prominent, the Nazi hunter for the U.S. Department of Justice. So since the Justice Department began a program in 1979 to track down and deport former Nazis, it has won 109 cases, the department said. But this may be the last U.S. Nazi case, said Eli Rosenbaum, a senior official at the department's Human Rights and Special Prosecution Unit, who was among those who tried the case against Mr. Berger. There's hardly anyone left, Mr. Rosenbaum said. The vast majority of the perpetrators have died. Mr. Berger's case was unique because it was the only one in the history of the Justice Department's Nazi prosecution program in which there were no known surviving victims available to testify, Mr. Rosenbaum said. German forces also destroyed the records from Meppen when they abandoned the camp in 1945. So prosecutors relied on documents found elsewhere. A crucial piece of evidence tying Mr. Berger to his Nazi past came from SS cards that identified guards in the Neuengamme camps, which were discovered in 1950 in a German ship that had been sunk by the Allies 5 years earlier in 1945. Mr. Rosenbaum said it was not clear how the cards were not destroyed after years underwater. After the ship was raised from the Baltic Sea, many of the cards were illegible and some were only partly legible. Those that could be read were transcribed and recorded. One of the cards identified Mr. Berger. It was needle in a haystack stuff, to put it mildly, Mr. Rosenbaum said. So just this case in particular, commenting on it, the one who has been responsible for over 40 years for prosecuting former Nazis points out this might be the last case. Also, in this case, there were no survivors left to testify. And the evidence came from a sunken ship raised in 1950 that they were able to somehow transcribe some of the cards and identify this, Frederick Karl Berger as a Nazi. Real needle in a haystack, to put it mildly. So, these articles clearly have some relevance to Yom HaShoah. It reminds us that the search for justice always has to continue. It also reminds us of how the number of survivors who are left to testify to what they experienced themselves is diminishing. It highlights that in this case, the former Nazi was identified by records that put him in the place, even without any type of real, evidence or eyewitness testimony. And the idea that the Nazi is held accountable even 75 years later. And I think that the sentiments expressed by the various officials align with our sense that justice has to prevail no matter how long. what I wanted to look at a little bit in terms of, as we move further away, and as the individuals who, whether it be who perpetuated this, are further away from their crimes, right? The Burgeri is talking about being 75 years, since that event, and he didn't even carry a gun, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How does Judaism look at the idea of teshuvah, the repentance for horrific crimes, or crimes in general, on the part, for example, of non-Jews? How does Judaism look at non-Jewish atonement, as well as what about the passage of time, in terms of people throughout Germany and other countries today where there were significant populations that were complicit in the murder of Jews? How do we look at how do we look at their descendants? What about forgiveness? Generations later, right? Never forget, but how do we move on? I remember a trip I took to Germany, about 15 years ago, to explore, modern Germany, and the German Foreign Ministry had a program to invite journalists and educators to see Germany and to address this issue in particular. How is Germany now? 70 years later, 75 years later, post-Holocaust, how are they grappling with the Holocaust, or how are they grappling with their Jewish community? So one of the sessions was in a high school. It was a Q&A session. And I got to ask the high school students questions, and they got to ask me questions. And, one of the things that a number of these students were saying, you're talking about 16-year-olds at the time, that, they said, first off, they all study the Holocaust already in 11th grade. They visit concentration camps. It's a major part of the educational curriculum in Germany. One of them noted that whenever they go to Western countries, they go to the United States, one of them had visited, they show the passport from Germany, they feel they're being judged by the passport official, from Germany. They think that everyone in the back of their mind is thinking, oh, Nazi. I said, well, look, it's not you. The Holocaust wasn't your fault, but you as a German are responsible. And that's a burden that they will carry forever. I also comment that riding the trains around Germany, through Berlin, you're standing next to sort of an older person. You're wondering what they were doing in 1941. You can't escape that sentiment in terms of being there. But there's some interesting textual sources. Some statements of the Talmud that try to address what happens with the descendants of those who are enemies of the Jews. So, or what happens what happens if a non-Jew sins and then converts to Judaism? Do they bear their sins with them? Right? We always talk about a convert as someone who's like newborn. So, what happens if a non-Jew sins and they could convert to Judaism? Does converting to Judaism wipe away their previous misdeeds? So the Talmud in Sanhedrin actually has this idea. Rabbi Hanina says, this is source number 1 on the sheets, if a Noachide cursed the name of God and afterward he converted to Judaism, he's exempt from punishment, since his trial procedure changed and the death penalty to which he is subject also changed, right? He blasphemed as a non-Jew, but now he's a Jew, so he shouldn't be punished. Talmud continues the discussion later. If a descendant of Noah struck and killed another Gentile or engaged in intercourse with the wife of another Gentile, which is a violation of Noahide law, it would be a capital offense under Noahide law, and he then converted to Judaism, he's exempt, right? Because he sinned as a Noahide, he should be punished as a Noahide, but now he's a Jew, and he can't be punished. But if he did so to an Israelite, killing a Jew or engaging in intercourse with the wife of a Jew as a Noahide and then converted, he is liable. If he sins against the Jew, then the sin carries over. So it seems that there's a difference in the Talmudic justice. And again, this is part of a larger discussion, which doesn't really have practical ramifications today. But it seems on the one hand, if the Noahide blasphemes, which is a capital offense, and converts to Judaism, it gets wiped away. But if the Noahide kills a Jew or commits a sexual crime against a Jew and converts, then there's still liability. So what's the difference between the sins, between blaspheming and murder? How come he seems to be let off the hook on blaspheming, but he's still on the hook for murder? So Tosfot, in the Talmud source number 2, point out that there's a difference between what's said there, b'dinei adam v'dinei shamayim. It's one thing when you sin against God. If you sin against God, the non-Jew sins against God and then converts to Judaism, God can forgive. But if a non-Jew commits an offense against a human being, well, converting to Judaism doesn't make it better, doesn't make the person who was wrong, who was injured, the family of the person who was murdered, feel any better. So when you sin against a human being, you can't just escape it by changing one's identity. Is what's going on in terms of the Talmud. That as an individual, if you sin against human beings, you can't escape. And we know this idea also with regards to Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day where we believe is a day of atonement. God can forgive us for the sins we commit against God, but human beings, other people who we wrong, Yom Kippur, we're supposed to ask them for forgiveness beforehand, because you can't escape or be forgiven for sins against another person just by time passing or changing one's identity or changing one's citizenship. The sin perpetrated against another person is not forgiven just because time has passed or locations have changed. And I think that certainly is reflected. Karl Berger spent 75 years living a law-abiding life. It doesn't matter. He sinned against people. He committed an offense. He perpetrated evil against people. That doesn't go away. So that's one Talmudic thrust in this discussion. Another one, though, is what about and this is something you sometimes will read about. What about descendants of the wicked? What about the grandchildren of Nazis who want to convert to Judaism or the like? It's not unheard of. And if in the Talmudic times, there was an idea of some of the worst enemies of the Jews having descendants who converted to Judaism. The Talmud in Gittin 57b, source number 3. Rabbi Chia bar Avin says that Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says, an old man from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem related to me. In the valley that lies before you, Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, killed 2,110,000 people, and in Jerusalem itself killed 940,000 people on one stone, until the blood of his victims flowed and touched the blood of Zechariah. There's a legend about Nebuzaradan killing Jews in the place where they executed the prophet Zechariah. And the Talmud continues that after killing so many people, at that moment, Nebuzaradan contemplated the idea of repentance and said to himself, if for the death of one soul, that of Zechariah, God punishes the Jewish people in this manner, then that man, that is to say, I, who has killed all those souls, all the more so I'll be subject to great punishment from God. After killing these 940,000 people, he starts to grow a conscience. So he fled and sent to his house a document detailing what was to be done with his property, and he converted to Judaism. That's what the Talmud says. I'm not so sure if I was one of those rabbis, if I'd want to be accepting him to the Jewish people, knowing what he did. But the Talmud seems to contemplate the possibility that this Russia, this evil murderer of many, many, many Jews, converts to Judaism. The Gemara adds that some of Haman's descendants studied Torah in Bnei Brak, and some of Sisera's descendants taught children Torah in Jerusalem, and some of Sancherib's descendants taught Torah in public. Who are they? Shmai and Avtalion, the teachers of Hillel the elder. So here we have some of the who's who of enemies of the Jewish nation having descendants who are the spiritual giants of the Jewish nation. So on the one hand, you can't escape your misdeeds. That's what we saw in Sanhedrin, Talmud Sanhedrin. And here we're seeing, well, wait a second, with enough generations going by, well, look, Huvuzar Adon himself seems to be able to convert, and certainly the descendants of wicked people seem to be able to become Jewish. Well, so let's take, what about a Nazi? What about the grandchild of a Nazi, great-grandchild of a Nazi wanting to convert? So source number 4 is from Rabbi Moshe Halevi Steinberg. He was a Polish rabbi who made Aliyah, was a rabbi in Israel, and wrote extensively on the subjects of conversion. And so he has a book on the subject, Chukat Hager, the law of the convert. And he writes, if we judge the matter based on humanity in general, or our national dignity or emotions in particular, it is clear that our conscience would not allow us to answer in the affirmative. A person like this, whose hands are full of Jewish blood, has no place in the camp of Israel. His place is far from the house of Israel. How difficult would it be to say of him, you are our brother? But from the perspective of dry halacha, I can see no reason not to accept him. Yeah, that is, according to Jewish law, there's room. There's room to accept. There's room to accept this, but it tastes bad, right? It leaves a bad taste in our mouth. How, this is not the person we want as one of ours. And Rabbi Shmuel Vosner, source number 5 on page 3 of the sources. No reason not to accept Germans as converts. If they genuinely are seeking. Right? So while it seems that the sins are never overlooked, but we also look at the seeking of the person, and it may seem distasteful, but technically it is halachically permissible. And so both Steinberg and Vosner require that the convert be genuine and really want to join the Jewish people. I would imagine, that again, I am not familiar personally of cases where this was dealt with by rabbis. I would imagine they wouldn't be cutting any corners for these converts to join the Jew. They would really want to make sure that these people are sincere. But how do you look at what happens when Nazis apologize and how or try to make amends? You notice that when Rabbi Wosner was dealing with the question, he mentions, he's talking about Nazis want to convert, but he lumps it with Germans, right? We've talked about before, the German people. It wasn't modern day German people's fault, but they are responsible. How do we look at that when we try to make amends, whether it be the individuals or the nation? And we have precedent for both. In 2016, this is another headline: former Auschwitz guard apologizes to victims in court. 94-year-old former Auschwitz guard currently on trial in Germany apologized to his victims in court. Reinhold Hanning, a former Nazi SS officer on trial for being an accessory to the murder of 170,000 people, said Friday in court in the western German city of Detmold that he is ashamed of that I knowingly let injustice happen and did nothing to oppose it. I see you're skeptical. I want to tell you that I deeply regret having been part of a criminal organization that is responsible for the death of many innocent people, for the destruction of countless families, for misery, torment, and suffering on the side of the victims and their relatives. Hanning said, reading from a written statement, according to Deutsche Welle, I have remained silent for a long time. I've remained silent all of my life. So, apology accepted. Holocaust survivor and co-plaintiff Leon Schwartzbaum said in court that he accepted Hamburg's apology, but could not forgive him. I lost 35 family members. How can you apologize for that? The 95-year-old said. I'm not angry. I don't want him to go to prison, but he should say more for the sake of the young generation today because the historical truth is important. So here you have, however we respond to that apology. Here's someone who's directly impacted by that, and he said, I'm not angry, right? I don't want him to go to prison, but I do expect more for him. There's a certain legacy of responsibility. Okay, we don't know. I would imagine some people disagree. I'm sure we can explore this with other survivors that we know, and it makes. But this is what happened. The Nazi apologizes, and this is the survivor's reaction. of an individual Nazi apology. And this survivor not really being so, not being so caught up in the words of apology of the past, but what are we doing now and going forward? You can't bring people back to life, but you can ensure that the story is continued to be told, and so that you can try and impact the future. This was a major issue in Israel in the early 1950s, right? In the aftermath of World War II, the new West Germany nation, in post-war Germany, as well as the nascent Jewish state. There started to be conversations as to what should the Germans do to support the Jewish state, right? The Germans were responsible for exterminating Jews. Well, now there's a Jewish state that's struggling. What could Germany do to help the Jews? Became the conversation. And there were negotiations for an effort on the part of the German people to apologize and also pay reparations. And that Israel in 1950, 51 was not the Israel it is today. There was still rationing of food. There were very few, material comforts available, and we were talking significant sums of money that would help bolster the new Jewish state. And so there were conversations, but remember, Israel also had lots of Holocaust survivors, and there was an outcry. How can the Jews negotiate with the Germans? And Ben-Gurion was prime minister, and he was involved in these negotiations, and he led the negotiations, and he signed a deal to accept reparations from Germany. One of the opening session to have these conversations, there was a lot of tension that the Israeli negotiators didn't want to shake hands with the German negotiators. So they set up a very big table that both sides entered from other sides of the room and went right to their seats. So they were sitting around the same table, but there were no pleasantries or introductions that would require handshakes, as an example. So it was a very painful chapter. And in particular, Menachem Begin was vehemently opposed. And source number 6 is from a speech he gave regarding the German reparations. You went to your constituents during the election not with this issue in mind. You went to the people for the sake of the Jewish religion, for the dignity of the Torah of Am Yisrael. But what does the Torah of Am Yisrael have to do with negotiations with Amalek? By doing so, you might as well erase a holy and sacred verse from the Torah and state that God carries his war against Amalek from generation to generation. How would God fight Amalek if you, the protectors of religion, vote for making peace with Amalek, namely for the sake of accepting money from him? He was directing his comments to the religious parties sitting in Ben-Gurion's government. Right, so there were many who were opposed to this, from whether it be for Begin, which was moral and built into religious tradition, or religious tradition. Rabbi Tzvi Weinman, source number 7. There are reports that in America, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky announced at a rabbinical conference that the majority opinion sides with the opinion of Rabbi Aaron Koller, who opposed all negotiations with Germany, even if large sums of reparations can be obtained. And the view of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav, was sought. Source number 8 from an article on the subject from Rav Tabori. He quotes those who invoke Rav Soloveitchik's opinion. Rav Hershel Schachter records that the Rav Joseph B. Soloveitchik opposed the agreement for 2 reasons. 1, accepting the money might indicate that the Jewish people had forgiven the Germans for the atrocities they committed. 2, he believed Germans had the status of Amalek and therefore not allowed to enjoy any benefit from them. Rav Soloveitchik understood that Amalek is not a specific race of people, but rather an entity that wishes to destroy the Jewish people. So it was about, religiously speaking, Amalek, but also ethically, morally, are we now good? The Germans are now forgiven for what happened because they're paying off the Jews. So Rav Tabori writes that my friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Nehemiah Kleinman, told me that he, as a Holocaust survivor, was entitled to accept money from Germany. He asked Rav Soloveitchik for his opinion. The Rav told him that even though he opposed accepting money, once the money is being distributed, one is allowed to accept it. The political battle was waged and lost, and now the funds can be used. And the funds have been used to support Holocaust survivors. Right, the Claims Conference, which is an organization that collects these funds that the German government sets aside for healthcare for survivors or for Holocaust education. Right, billions of dollars have been paid out over these last 70 years for the subject. So, what is the legacy, in terms of interacting or collaborating or accepting money from the perpetrators of the Holocaust? A painful chapter. Ben-Gurion would say that Israel would not have survived without that level of investment of funds from Germany at that moment in time. Another way that people sometimes relate to this is, what about German products? Can we use German products, right? I remember growing up, it was kind of like, oh my gosh, how does that Jew drive a Mercedes-Benz? Again, it's a sentiment that some people have, some people don't. Is there a religious component? Is there a religious problem? And so Rabbi Shlomo Aviner sums up the issue in source number 9, where he says, "Haklal ha'oleh she'eni sor liknos totzeret Germani." There's no prohibition against buying German products. Ach behechlet yesh ma'ala lehimana mikach. He says there certainly is there's an advantage, an ethical, spiritual advantage to refrain. Everybody has to make their own determination. It is, Ben-Gurion took the reparations and Begin lambasted them, and some religious authorities forbade it and others permitted, and some b'diavad after the fact it became okay. It's clear that as time goes by, right, we're probably going to see, as we saw at the very beginning, we're not going to see many deportations of former Nazi guards who are living in America. We're going to see fewer, if any, additional trials in Germany against former Nazis. But we're grappling with some of the after effects as the actors in the saga, whether it be the Nazis or the survivors, grow fewer and fewer. How will we be relating to the descendants? How are we relating to the countries that acted in this way? It's an issue that involves a Jewish relationship with other European countries, Hungary, Ukraine, Russia, Poland. These are issues that we read about often, as well as the larger issue as time goes by. Is there a sense of forgive and forget? Forget, absolutely not, but what kind of hatred and anger is maintained? Think of the reaction of Schwarzbaum to the apology. He wasn't really interested in what had happened. He was interested in what's going to happen next. And in the reparations conversation, it happened. What do we do next? Rav Aviner recognizing that people are going to respond differently. Some people will be anything German is treif, and some people will be, wait a second, that's the kind of car I want to drive. It's not a Nazi car anymore. So I think that in terms of processing this, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has a good summary of this issue of moving on and how do we move on. Especially when confronting these types of headlines or issues or topics. It's a video. The link to the video is there in source number 10. In Judaism, only the victim can forgive. Supposing somebody injures my next door neighbor, can I forgive the person who did it? What have I got to do with it? I'm a third person. There's no vicarious forgiveness in Judaism. And the reason there's no vicarious forgiveness in Judaism is there's no vicarious guilt in Judaism. Jeremiah and Ezekiel both say the soul that sins shall die, nobody else. So only the victim can forgive. Even God can't forgive on behalf of the victim. The late Rabbi A.J. Heschel writes in his response to the sunflower. Right? The sunflower was Simon Wiesenthal's book about how do you respond to the Nazis. Can they be forgiven was essentially the question. And he asked a number of people. And Rabbi Heschel's response was that on Yom Kippur, we say the Day of Atonement only atones for sins between us and God. It doesn't atone for sins between us and our fellow until our fellow forgives us, because God can't forgive us on behalf of our fellow human beings. He can only forgive offenses against himself. The trouble with the Holocaust is all the victims are dead. And we came across this in the Sanhedrin text. So we can't forgive the perpetrators of the Holocaust. And to think we can is to misunderstand the nature of forgiveness. On the other hand, we can certainly seek reconciliation with the next generation, or with the faiths that might have contributed in some way to anti-Semitism or what have you. We certainly don't harbor a grudge. We don't. And this is the way he concludes. I never met a Holocaust survivor whose life was filled with hate or anything of the kind. So no, you cannot forgive, but you begin a new way together. I think that captures the way Schwarzman was responding to the Nazi apology, is that, a few things. In many ways, it's the survivors who have the right to a direct reaction. The rest of us have to do our best to keep the memory alive and keep the issue alive, but ultimately, going forward, we can't turn back the clock, we can't stop the clock, we're gonna have to find a new way forward. And so I think as we approach this year's Yom HaShoah, it might be becoming too late to hunt Nazis because there aren't any left. And there are fewer and fewer survivors to provide eyewitness testimony, but we can review the facts and the stories and their testimonies and soak in as much of the first person perspective as possible, ultimately to navigate a way forward, both in grappling with the descendants of the perpetrators, but also in general, how are we going to best remember them, which in many ways is how we're going to build the future, built upon the legacies that they leave for us. So something to think about this Yom HaShoah. I'm happy to take questions or comments.